Hello and welcome back, and today I want to talk about improving Plex performance on your network attached storage device. What simply means maybe you own a NAS drive and you've been using it as a Plex media server for a number of years or even a matter of months or days, and you've noticed that performance is nowhere near what you expect. Maybe you've got stuttering, maybe you've got no audio, no sound. In fact, I'm going to be using a tablet today because there are so many things I'm going to cover in today's video. But some of the most common things that people find as issues with their Plex media server is everything from stuttered playback to zero or poor buffering, everything media file type not supporting, transcoding engine unsupported, and more stuff like that. Effectively, that you just want to watch the media you own on your Plex media server, but you just can't. Maybe you're on an iPhone or an old Android, a smart TV or a console, but one way or another, the output of that audio is just not cutting it. So today I've got 10, technically 11, tips for you and getting the very best performance from your Plex media server. A lot of these are free, some of them you have to pay a little bit extra for, but all of them in one way or another will improve your Plex media server performance. So let's go straight into number one. This is utilizing offline transcoding. Now, this is something not a lot of people know about. They're aware of transcoding, and for those that aren't aware, transcoding is the ability to take your original media file that might be massive and change it in resolution, file type, size, scale and more, and file type to a version more befitting to your device, your mobile phone, your console, maybe something that doesn't play that original file type or doesn't support the resolution. Transcoding will change its shape. The problem is transcoding uses a lot of system resources to do that. So one of the ways in which you can get around that is doing offline transcoding. What that means is your NAS will then take all the media that you either choose one by one or entire directories, and you can tell the NAS in a schedule to take all that media and create smaller, better versions of it. In real terms, sorry, got to clear my throat there. In real terms, what that means is you might have loads of 4K movies that you're going to be playing on a bunch of devices that don't support 4K. And when trying to transcode it in real time, that can really tax the NAS system. And that can be one of the main ways a lot of people get poor performance. So one of the ways around it, as I say, is to get the NAS to do all of that in advance, maybe on a schedule during the night when you're not using the device, or maybe when you're at work. And then it will create duplicates of these files and put them on another area of the NAS. It will duplicate them in a smaller version, and when you want to access that file in this different version, the NAS will automatically take the new and improved or the new and downscaled version, thereby eliminating live transcoding and improving performance. On screen throughout this, hopefully on that side of the screen, should be the pros and cons of each. So I could read through them, but I'm not going to. If you would rather read through this, by the way, the NAS Compare article for parts 1 and part 2 of this should be in the description. But moving on to number 2. Second thing to change, maybe a RAID level. Most of you that utilize a NAS server as a Plex media server have some kind of RAID. You've got more than one hard drive inside, and maybe you've got the drives all RAIDed together, and you've got at least one drive of failure. That's what RAID is. It protects you, redundant array of inexpensive disk or redundant array of independent disks. I'm going to cater to both of you. If you're using a NAS, chances are you've got RAID, whether it's 2 bay, 4 bay, 6 bay, and 8 bay, or bigger. Now, different RAID levels give you different amounts of performance. They give you different areas of safety, 1, 2, or more drives, but different RAID levels, because of the way the CPU handles the data, will actually improve or ruin the read and write speed over time. And unless you've got a very good CPU, like a good powered Intel or an AMD, you may see dips in performance. So for a number of you that have got 2 bays, chances are that you've got a RAID 1. That's 2 disks that are, you have basically 2 disks that are being read and written to at all times at the same time. And that way, if one of the disks fails, you've still got all of your data. But you can actually get better read and write speeds by changing that RAID configuration. And indeed, we've got a whole video coming up soon with RAID 1 versus SHR, where the kind of pros and cons have been discussed. But this isn't really for you. For people that have ordered 4 bay NASs that have got a RAID 5 or a RAID 6, that is slower because the CPU has to create something called parity, which is kind of like a blueprint that Every time there's data written across the drives, one drive is then selected and a little blueprint of all the rest of the data that's been written is put there. And with every instruction, every wipe of data, the instruction is moved to a different disk. And therefore, if you lose one disk, the system can rebuild the data when you introduce a new disk. But the parity data creation does hit your read and write speeds unless you've got a very powerful CPU. So there are advantages to changing and downgrading your RAID to get better performance. And if you do have a 4-bay that isn't fully populated, or a 4-bay that's got 4 disks, and you can, split them into 2 RAID 1s based on the data inside, you will see performance benefits. Now, this isn't a small task. Hopefully the advantages and disadvantages should be there on screen. But one of the biggest disadvantages, of course, is one, you're going to have to move your data elsewhere while you're doing this, and 2, you can potentially lose a lot of capacity in favour of that speed. Now, next advantage, using SSD cache. Now, this is where we enter one of the options where you have to pay a little bit more. If you do have an available bay on your NAS, or you've got a NAS that has dedicated SSD bays, you can introduce a solid state drive to your hard drive array that will boost the overall performance. So hard drives are typically, because they're mechanical, they have a limitation of speed, and they have limitations overall of the way they run because of spinning heads and arms and stuff like that. Whereas SSDs, because they're chip read, will end up being much, much faster. So it'd be great if you could have a NAS filled with SSDs, you'd have loads of performance, but that's really, really expensive, and SSDs give you less space. So the result is, if you get a bunch of hard drives and you've got space for 1 or 2 SSDs, you can create an area of caching, read and write caching, but in the sense of Plex, read caching or read-only cache will do. With that, you end up with the ability to completely improve your read and write speeds, and it will buffer the system to improve your performance in a Plex Media server. But you will have to spend a little bit more, and I would recommend matching the SSD to your hard drives around 10%. What that means is, if you've got 10 terabytes of hard drive space, get 1 terabyte of SSD and scale that accordingly. 10% should be a magical number there. Pros and cons on the screen. Next, we can move on to my next tip number 4. Tip number 4, increasing the memory. Now, anyone that's ever built a PC or used a PC or heard of a PC will know about improving memory is one of the easiest ways to improve performance in anything. Memory is kind of like this, it's kind of, random access memory, or the RAM. What that does is it's basically for handling jobs right now, and every job that you do, every app you run, it will take that app on board and run partially, depending on the application and the way its architecture is, in that memory. The more people accessing a NAS, the more memory has to be allocated, and that's when you get memory limits and this memory just not being enough. So increasing the memory on your NAS, if it lets you, is advantageous, but you do hit a limit really of when that becomes in any way beneficial. I'd say between 8 and 16 gig is normally enough. You can increase the memory if you've got loads of people accessing 4K media, but to be honest, 8 to 16 max should be more than enough for your Plex Media server to work fluidly. If you've got less than 8 and you're living somewhere at 2 to 4 gig, that might be one of the reasons you're having issues. But again, this is one of those ones that requires spending a little bit more. And of course, some NASs do not let you upgrade memory. Maybe they're using some of those Realtek CPUs and they're using memory that's quite literally been soldered onto the motherboard inside that controller board. So double check that you can upgrade and whether it's worth upgrading at all. Moving on to chapter 5. This is another software one, and luckily one that won't cost you a bean, and it's very easy to check it out. Indeed, you could probably check it in a quicker time than it's taking you to watch this video so far. More for you. Check the resource monitor on your NAS. Now, NAS systems are 24/7 devices. They are designed to be on for a very huge amount of time, months on end. Indeed, a lot of the updates and stuff that arrive for the applications, and indeed the entire firmware of your NAS, some of them won't even require your NAS to be powered down. They're designed around their architecture. It's one of the reasons why NASs use power efficient components, use power efficient builds, and are designed to just be on for greater lengths of time. It's why you might look at the hardware in a NAS sometimes and go, what? That's a Celeron. How are they charging so much for a Celeron? But that's another video. Now, When it comes down to it, if you're utilizing a NAS for 24/7 and using different applications, or the NAS itself has scheduled tasks and scheduled things it needs to do, it will have loads of MIDI applications. What you see as the graphical user interface, if it's Synology DSM, if it's QNAP QTS, if it's Acer Store ADM, if it's TerraMaster TOS, whichever one you're using, you are looking at a graphical user interface. You are looking at something that the system has generated to make it user-friendly to you. Behind that are hundreds, maybe even thousands of individual processes. And if you open up a resource monitor in the same way you Control Alt Delete on a modern Windows 10 PC, a task manager will appear and list every single background operation, not the programs, because it might show you only 2 or 3. You want the background operations. You want the tasks, the one that lists every one of those, hundreds if not thousands of applications. And what you can find out with some simple Googling is a lot of the things your NAS might be doing aren't necessary. It's a task that should have gone to idle, a process that is completed but still sitting there in the memory, and all these things can add up substantially to using your system resources and use a lot of that live caching in memory that you should be using for other things. So I strongly recommend you go to the resource monitor and see what is using your CPU and memory. What is the usage? Which are the ones that are using 1% or more? And if there's loads of them using less than 1%, maybe look into those too. Those are some of the great ways in which you can utilize that resource monitor to see where the issues are. Play Plex Media video with or without transcoding that you're having issues with, and see what's happening in the back end of that NAS, what the resource monitor is doing, and are there things to do with scanning stuff or antivirus or anti-malware or some sort of background operation that's just eating up all those resources. But let's move on to number 6. Tip number 6, hardware transcoding. Is Plex utilizing your transcoding engine? Now, a number of you have bought NASs in the past because it said it featured transcoding. Now, transcoding is a subject we are going to keep touching on in this video. I know I've already touched on it like 8 times, but the reason is because Plex, as good as Plex is, it only is produced in software, and the result is that all the hardware that we buy over the years chops and changes, and the media files we buy, though compatible then, might not be compatible now, and vice versa. That's why transcoding is so important, and why it's a heavy recommendation for the best Plex media server NAS. Now, hardware transcoding in its simplest form is when a CPU inside a NAS or whatever you're using as your Plex media server is graphically enabled. It has embedded graphics or has a transcoding engine, depending on which specifications you read. What that means in real terms is the CPU has got all that power and that clock speed and stuff, but it also has an extra component built into it that's specialized for handling graphics. Now, in terms of transcoding, this is very important, because the raw power of a CPU to chop and change a file is not going to be as specialized a tool as a graphically embedded or graphically enabled part of that CPU. The result is that it requires way more power from a CPU doing it raw to change a file than a small amount of graphical embedding or a transcoding engine to do the same job, because it's more specialized towards it. Now, NASs that advertise they've got transcoding engines, of which I would say more than half of them advertise that fact, or embedded graphics in one form or another. All of these companies advertise this, but Plex doesn't necessarily have access to that engine, and it only in some cases, and particularly only with Intel NASs, Intel CPU based NASs that I've got graphical embedding, have we seen Plex be able to take advantage of that component. You take advantage to look at that and go, we need this file transcoded, we're going to ask the NAS, can we use the transcoding engine? And NAS has gone, knock yourself out. That's not always the case, and in a number of cases, such as the Realtek ARM-based CPUs, some of the older Braswell CPUs, we have seen that Plex, even if you have a Plex pass and click that little option that says video encoding or transcoding enabled, make my CPU hurt, even though you've enabled that option, it doesn't have access to the transcoding engine, and instead it will ask the NAS will go, nope, I'm not going to let you use the transcoding engine or the graphics, but I'm going to let you use raw clock speed and CPU power to convert that file. And just unfortunately, that is not efficient and will make the CPU on that NAS work really hard. Consequently, you will get those performance issues if the file is just too big. So double check that the CPU in your NAS has got transcoding enabled and that Plex is able to take advantage of it. Not just that Plex has graphical embedding support and that it can enable transcoding with a Plex pass, but it genuinely has access to that engine. Moving on to number 7, we can talk about the upload speed. Now, this is hugely overlooked. I blame companies in America, maybe Comcast or whatever, in the UK. I definitely blame companies like Virgin for this. People get their internet package, they go to their internet service provider and they advertise all these big things. Oh, we'll give you 50 meg, 100 meg, 2 million meg download speed. It's going to be mad fast. But they don't talk about upload speeds anywhere near as much. Upload is incredibly important when it comes to a Plex Media server, because although when you're in the home, you're watching files on the network, which is, the way all the devices are all sharing the same Wi-Fi, I'm going to caveman it down to that. When you're accessing the Plex Media server from outside your home, the NAS has to upload this file via the internet to you. It doesn't so much go to you. Plex servers are involved to a degree, but the fact still remains that Plex needs to rely on upload speeds. The result is that when you upload that file, if you've got a poor upload connection, so that's the data going up, not down, that one that they talk about on all the adverts, if you've got a crap upload, nearly said a bad word, if you've got a bad upload speed, it immediately becomes a bottleneck. And that means that your NAS is trying desperately to send this file via this tiny little bandwidth to you, which immediately affects performance, because you're going on the other end on your phone or whatever, your client device, going, come on, I want to watch this movie, come on, and you're desperate for it, but the NAS just can't deliver it. The NAS is working fine. It's the funnel, the upload in between. And if you enable transcoding, you might be able to avoid that, but transcoding engines, a lot of them, and particularly NASes that need to be more optimized with more recent versions of Plex, aren't smart enough to identify the upload issue and will not enable transcoding by default. It will basically ask you to make the decision, which just isn't right. So double check your upload speeds. And again, I know this isn't something you can immediately change, because let's face it, you might be signed into a 6-12 month contract, but maybe try to bait with your internet service provider to upgrade to another deal, because upload can be a tremendous bottleneck. If you're worried about your upload speeds or you don't know your upload speeds, seriously, Google speed test or internet speed test, bung it into Google right now, Control-T, open another tab after this video, finish to the end, so there are other tips, and then look up, just put speed test or internet speed test into Google. There's an automated one built in there. Click run and your upload and download speed will be measured, and then you know. So next, after upload and download speeds, and there's lots of information there. Number 9, checking your codec. Now, this is an odd one because not all NAS brands go about this the same way. If you own a WD or a Netgear NAS, sorry, this isn't for you, because they still haven't implemented this in the way that they should. A NAS comes out at a certain time with the software that it arrives with, and even though a CPU covers certain codecs and file formats, a codec is basically just a transcription, if you will, of what's been used to create this video, this enormous video that's now been compressed into a video format that you can play, WMV, AVI, MKV, MOV, all these different codecs. But you need to make sure your NAS supports all of these codecs, supports all these file formats, because even if you can transcode, it heavily relies on the NAS being able to see and interact with the file to start with. Otherwise, you end up in a kind of double transcoding situation, which is terrible. Which, again, caveman way to put it. There are better ways to put that sentence. But the result is, if you don't have the latest codecs, or you don't have the codecs, even simple ones, that are quite prevalent but still quite rare and difficult, such as MP4A, MKV, and definitely MOV in some of those higher dense files, then you are not going to be able to play those files, period. And if you do have them but not supported very well, or not the most recent revisions of them, then again you're going to have poor performance. So what I recommend is see if the App Center on your NAS, and I know Synology and QNAP have got this, I think Acer Store too, check if they have updated codec packs, updated video format packs that allow you to download periodically and update all of your media types. You should even have an option to make that an auto download, and if you do, set it so that means you never have to check it once, and it's free. And look at that phone pad off the wall. Number 10, probably the second most expensive recommendation on this list: install a graphics card. Now when I say install a graphics card in your NAS, I ain't talking about every single NAS brand out there. In fact, to my knowledge, there is only one NAS brand that actually lets you do this in a workable fashion, and that is QNAP at the moment. Now, if you own a QNAP NAS with a PCIe slot that doesn't have HDMI on it, chances are, if it's a newer generation, it does give you the ability to install a graphics card inside. And with things like GPU pass-through and increased support of different graphics cards, the result is that you are able to install a graphics card and utilize those graphical assets, just like we talked about earlier on, inside your Plex Media server. So instead of using embedded graphics on the CPU, you're now using an enormous graphics card that will power your system and do all of the transcoding and the performance work and the video work for you. Now, of course, this is expensive. Not just because of graphics cards, it's also expensive because of things like cryptocurrency and data mining and all of these people that have basically pushed up the price of graphics cards for everyone else, that even relatively basic graphics cards can be very, very expensive. You don't need an incredibly powerful one of those. Some NASs will have 500, 600, 700 watt PSUs, so you can install real monster NVIDIA cards and stuff like that. But you can get away with quite modest GPU cards to introduce 512, 1 gig, 2 gig of video memory to your NAS, and it will allow it to utilize those assets. It is worth mentioning, however, that there are only certain graphics cards that are supported by different QNAP NASs, and if you get the wrong one, it can be problematic later on. So what I recommend is do check out the articles, as I've mentioned before below. There is also a link to supported graphics cards within QNAP NAS. The focus from them seems to largely be to do with virtualization, but I do know you can utilize the system properties in a number of Plex Media Server applications too. QNAP being the only ones that have got this, it makes it a kind of half-half tip. But that said, as it's my last tip of the 10, that I have seen moves by other NAS brands to move into this area. One of which, of course, is Synology, who have released the DVA3219. Their Synology surveillance application NAS also has DSM that has an NVIDIA graphics card built into it in the PCIe slot. And if they see success for that, I can definitely see them rolling out that same kind of logic into other NAS devices, bigger, maybe smaller, because it is only a 4-bay, so who knows. But I would be very interested to see how Synology utilize this technology into DSM and other applications too. Now, I do have one more tip, tip 11, because I know I said this is tip 1 to 10, which I will highlight, but I didn't really think it's a real tip. That's why I'm chucking it here at the end. And it's not a great one. You won't like it. Buy a new NAS. If you've been using the same NAS for a number of years, or you're using a NAS that just doesn't have graphical embedding, you are gonna have a bad time. And it might be time to bite the bullet and buy a new NAS. Now, that said, because of the evolution of this technology and the way these systems work, you don't need to spend crazy. You just need to spend smart. And that's what I want to talk about, because not only are there links in the description to the top tips for improving Plex performance, but on top of that, they should have been published by now. We've got best Plex NAS for 500, 1,000 and 2,000. Now, the reason I'm not saying a currency really is because I'm trying to get one that it's $500, pounds, euro, or whatever, and the same goes for $1,000, pounds, euro, $2,000, pounds, euro, and that's got to include storage and VAT. And these are NASs that aren't tipped to be the most powerful, incredible, incredible NASs, but these are ones that I'm telling you, within that budget, will give you the best for Plex. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you can get a 500 quid NAS, including tax and storage, and it's going to be as good as a 2.5, 3 grand NAS. I'm not saying that. I'm saying this is the very best you can do in that budget, and that's why I've taken the time to go through those. I'll hopefully produce those on videos too, but in the meantime, do check out the NAS Compare articles, and of course, if you are looking at NAS, do go to the guys at span.com, the NAS experts, 25 years in the biz. I wouldn't just bang on about them if I didn't believe in it. Because, you know, here I am. A few years down the line, it must be working, and quite frankly, so must they. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. I've got loads of videos coming out on the new Synologies, the new QNAPs, the new Acer stores, the new, all of them. But of course, also about everything to do with NAS and more. So do subscribe and click the bell to be more notified about these videos as and when they happen. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.